Well, hi once again all my YouTube subscribers, and I hope you're all keeping well in these very strange times, and thanks yet again for returning to my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel as we check out yet more of those vintage off-road machines from back in the day. Now in this next short video clip we are going to take a brief look at another European classic, so I hope you'll hang around with me for the next few minutes as we take a look at Paul Armour's 1980 414 Montesa Cappra. Now, as far as a bike's originality goes and its ownership, they don't come much more authentic than Paul's superb looking Montesa. Now, Paul told me he still recalls the time when he visited Harrison's motorcycle dealership in Sedberg in Cumbria with the cash in his pocket, with his intention to buy this 414 Montesa that he spied in the shop window. Now, soon after £1,200 was exchanged, Paul loaded the bike up onto his trailer and headed home. Although who'd have guessed that more than 40 years later Paul would still own the bike, and not only that, it would still be in its original and 1980s condition. Now, up until a few years ago, Paul's Montesa was still in its original 1980s state. Now, that was of course until the dreaded winter floods hit Sedberg and Paul's beloved Cappra was then submerged in 6 feet of water. Now, after the water had subsided, Paul had to strip the bike to rid it of all the water damage and subsequently then rebuilt it, although it's still as original as the day he first purchased it. Now, these short video clips and pictures of the bike were taken just prior to Paul racing the bike in the 2018 Cumberland Grand National Scramble near Penrith. Now, these 414 Cappra motors are your standard single-cylinder 2-stroke piston port engine with a bore of 88mm and a stroke of 68mm. But overall, these were quite hardy little engines if you looked after them. Okay, they were maybe not the most powerful power plant for a 1980s motocrosser, but they still performed well enough and gave good service for your average club rider. But they were still better and more powerful models to be had if you had the cash in 1980. Now, the fuel is fed to this engine by a Bing carburetor, which in their day were very good carbs despite their basic internal engineering, but they were still renowned for being able to make good horsepower from small engines. Now, these Montesas are not a machine that you see quite often at classic and vintage race events, and these Montesas are really in a kind of minority group really, and it's only your hardened Montesa fanatics, including of course Paul, who keep these bikes, keep them running and race them on the racetrack on a daily basis. But it's still good to see that the likes of Paul and other Montesa fans keep these bikes out there on the track where they belong. Now, these Cappras had a decent set of forks, as I remember, and of course they were hydraulic air assisted systems. Now, there wasn't much scope for adjustment on these forks. You could add or remove air through the Schrader valve on the top of each fork leg to stiffen or soften them up, although if you needed more fine tuning then you could experiment with different weights of oil, which sometimes helped with the dampening. Now these rear shocks are still the original items from 1980, although I'm not sure what particular make they actually are, although it's still amazing to think that these are still functioning after 40 years, and as far as I'm aware, Paul has never had them apart or serviced them since that time. But they still look in remarkably good condition, and more importantly, they still work. Now without question, this exhaust expansion chamber is still the one that was fitted to the bike when Paul pulled it out of the dealer's showroom more than 40 years ago. Now because these Montesas had the upswept pipe, it kept them away from most of the damage that usually gets inflicted on these motocrosser exhaust systems. But once again, this alloy rear tailpipe is the true 1980 item, which again is ultra rare really, as normally these parts are changed within the first few seasons of a motocross bike's life. Now as you would expect, a plastic fuel tank on these 414 Cappras, as just about all off-road motorcycle manufacturers of the time were using these plastic fuel tanks as their material of choice when it came to manufacturing these fuel cells. Now you don't need more proof than this big Montesa M logo on the mudguard to know that this is still the authentic item from 1980. Now these Montesas had also a very comfy seat, as I remember, although Paul's is looking a little bit worse for wear after its 40 years in service. Although despite a little patch and a running repair here and there, the bike seat is still in good condition considering the punishment it suffered during that time. Now Paul's Montesa has an alloy 52 tooth rear sprocket on his machine, which should be geared about right once he slips that Montesa into the elusive top gear. Now of course, because this was still 1980, many motocrossers were still utilising drum brakes front and rear. It would be another year or two before manufacturers were standardising hydraulic disc brakes on their motocross machines. But these Montesas had decent drum brakes front and rear. Now most of the bike's controls, including the handlebars, the levers and cables, are all basically still 1980 parts, although I think Paul's fitted a replacement set of grips to his Cappra, which is fully understandable considering the bike's age. But nevertheless, it's still good to see so many original working parts on one of these old Montesa crossers. But when you take into account the bike's age and the many years of racing it's done in its life, and of course surviving being submerged in 6 feet of water, Paul's done quite a good job of getting his pride and joy back up and running again. Now it would have been so easy for Paul to replace many of the water damaged original parts with new pattern pieces, although naturally he had to replace the bearings and seals on the motor because of the water damage, but it's still essentially a nice example of a 1980 Montesa Cappra, and what's more, it's still being used on the racetrack. Now the other point I noticed on this bike is that it seems to have quite a small rear wheel. Now that looks to me like a 17-inch rear wheel. Now maybe my more knowledgeable YouTubers will be able to help me out with this particular point, because I wasn't really sure if that was the original rear wheel for this bike. But the other point is the front tyre on this bike is still the original front tyre from 1980. So there you have it, another quick look back at another nice original classic from back in the good old days of twin shock racing motocross. That's Paul Armour's 1980 Montesa 414 Cappra. Now I hope you'll continue to stay tuned to my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, because in my next video we're going to take a look at Jonathan Lusk's 1980 YZ465 Yamaha. So until next time, please stay safe, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be back out there doing what we love and enjoy, and that is of course riding classic dirt bikes. This video was brought to you in association with VMX Magazine, your #1 publication for classic, vintage and off-road motorcycles. Just visit their online website for more information.